Okay, so we'll start by setting our motivation. So we generate minds of confidence in the Buddha's wisdom, its relevance for our own lives, this reliable, repeatable path set out by the Buddha and presented in such an extraordinary way in the Lamrim teachings. Recognizing that the Lamrim is, in a way, the manifestation of the three jewels of refuge, the Buddha, his teachings, and the community of practitioners who deeply realize his teachings, like Lama Tsongkhapa, like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Lama Yeshe. And we see that the point of those teachings, the point of getting the result of following this path of mental training, is not for one's own benefit alone, but principally to be of limitless benefit for all sentient beings. So we generate these minds of confidence and refuge and bodhicitta. All right. So we are starting a new section today called the evolution. What it's being called here in Lamrim Year is the evolution of samsara. If we map this onto the middle length Lamrim, then it would be we're still in the middle scope, but in terms of, for example, the middle length Lamrim, it's chapter 12, which begins, the section is called Contemplating the Stages of Involvement in Cyclic Existence, the Origins. So, in a way, very similar to what Lama Zopa, Lama Yeshe are calling it, the evolution of samsara. So, in a way, we can say that the topic of renunciation has two, I guess, three distinct parts to it. And we just covered the first part, which are the sufferings, the 8 sufferings, the 6 sufferings, the 3 sufferings, kind of the downside of cyclic existence. And then the second section, still on the general theme of renunciation, are the afflictions. What are the afflictions? What triggers the afflictions? How the arising of the afflictions creates karma to generate cyclic existence. And then the third, it's somewhat distinct, but also just an elaboration of that. If you want to say that there's 3 sections, the third section are the 12 links of dependent origination, which again is just kind of putting, in a way, it's just kind of putting that into a framework that is that explains how death and rebirth work in cyclic existence based on the afflictions. So it doesn't directly bring in the sufferings, but it kind of says, okay, well, now that we've looked at the afflictions and how that they're triggered and what they are, then this is how they impact death and rebirth to create cyclic existence for an ordinary sentient being. So you could say that there's 2 sections. You could say that there's 3 sections. I don't know. But we are in the section, the beginning of that is understanding the afflictions. So in the middle length Lamrim, they say this has 3 points: how the mental afflictions arise, how karma is thereby accumulated, how you die, transmigrate, and take rebirth. So what's interesting here is that I know we're not studying the middle length Lamrim, but there's an interesting section that kind of calls back to the realization of emptiness and the things that we've talked about before, where it says, although both karma and mental afflictions are necessary as causes that establish cyclic existence, the mental afflictions are primary. This is because if there are no mental afflictions, even though there is karma beyond counting accumulated previously, that grammar is weird. Since the cooperative conditions for karma are absent, the sprout of suffering is not established. Just as a sprout is not established from a seed that lacks humidity, soil, and so forth, it is also because if mental afflictions are present, even without any previously accumulated karma, karma is immediately accumulated anew, and future aggregates will be appropriated. So this is, kind of getting at, if we see emptiness directly and we eliminate fundamental ignorance, then all of the cooperative causes and conditions that trigger the previously accumulated karmic propensities, karmic seeds that we've not been able to purify or experience are rendered inoperative because of the cooperative causes and conditions of the afflictions, all of which are springing from fundamental ignorance. So, and then of course, this is also saying that you could, hypothetically, you could imagine a sentient being that somehow, is brand new and has had no previous lives. But if they possess the afflictions, necessarily in that next moment, they will begin that process of creating karma because the afflictions are present in the mind. So that's kind of why it's so important to study that, to study the afflictions and their antidotes, to understand deeply how our samsara is created. So in day 239, Lama Yeshe talks about that we don't have to, it isn't really necessary, it isn't necessary to actually have texts to study. I mean, for emptiness, probably it is, but in terms of just getting kind of the Buddha's point about afflictions, all we really have to do is look at our own experiences and recognize the mind. This is getting at later when we go into each of the individual afflictions, and not all of them, but the more primary ones. Recognizing their arising in our own mind and seeing how they make us miserable, how they create suffering, even just in a conventional way, even just interpersonally, in terms of how we live our life, and the decisions that we make, where we spend our money, what we spend our time doing, how we treat other people. We can recognize the problematic aspects of the afflictions just by paying close attention to these parts of our own life. We don't need to read about them from the Buddha or from, that just sort of validates what we ourselves would find if we looked clearly. So, and then, Lama Yeshe's kind of reiterating the same point made in the middle length Lamrim, where he says, it's not just that we're alive, therefore we're in samsara. It's linked to our ignorant, grasping, dull attitude. That's what makes our life samsara. So, if, so the high level bodhisattvas, the Buddhas, and so on, they might exist in the same environment, and they might, be, but their mind is free from the afflictions, and therefore they are not in samsara. They're not creating the cause of their samsara. And then he encourages us to have a meditation practice, because he says through that we can be released from all of this, what he's calling here. Sometimes Lama Yeshe he kind of makes up phrases. He's saying emotional self-sensitivity. He's kind of known for, he just kind of makes phrases up where he's trying to get some point across. But and so I think he says with release, our life becomes more stable. We have fewer expectations because we understand the nature of things, that the pleasure they give is limited. So I think he means by emotional self-sensitivity, kind of this up and down that we've talked about throughout, the various chapters, where because of craving and grasping, our mind is not stable. The opposite of what he's saying we can be released from. The mind is incredibly reactive to changes in the environment, what people say or don't say or do or don't do. We don't have that spaciousness in the mind. We don't have the stability of the mind. Everything is just ping-ponging from pleasant to unpleasant, from attachment, desire to aversion, and the mind is very up and down all the time. And so he says knowledge of how samsara works is itself renunciation. So, understanding that all we have to do, and when we've already done a lot of that in this section where we looked at all of the sufferings of samsara, understanding that's part of understanding how it works. And so what he's saying is that necessarily a person who understands these things doesn't really have to do anything other than that. Renunciation will arise spontaneously in a person who has this wisdom, and they don't get this wisdom and then have to do more or something else that generates renunciation. Renunciation is the logical response to understanding how samsara works. Just like we all already have renunciation toward, hard drugs and things, heroin and things, because we know, it could be right there in front of us, the syringe or whatever, and we would take it to the police station. We wouldn't be like, oh yeah, maybe I'll try heroin today. We're not going to wake up and just decide, because we have a lot of information. Now, I mean, of course, there might be other things, alcohol or, other things that aren't as intense. But at least we understand through news reports and, through things that we've seen with our own direct experience that, yeah, it looks kind of fun for a couple of seconds. But then all of these incredible, there's a high probability of just dropping dead. If not, there's incredible health problems. And so we don't have to think about it. We don't have to contemplate. It isn't something that that we may or may not do with respect to some, some things in our that are clear to us. And this is just doing this in a deeper way. Once, the Buddha is saying, and Lama Yeshe is saying, and Lama Zopa is saying that once we really deeply understand all of these points, we will turn away from creating the causes and the conditions of getting more of that. And we will be motivated to create the causes and the conditions of enlightenment, hopefully, from the Mahayana perspective. Any thoughts or questions so far? Okay, so then if we go to day 240, Lama Yeshe is going to talk about the 6 kind of primary afflictions, which are attachment, anger, and here in some places, pride is, as it is here, it's just called pride. That's also true in the middle length Lamrim, it's just called pride. But it is sometimes also called deluded pride, whereas here he does say deluded doubt and distorted views. Distorted views are the same thing as wrong views that we've looked at in previous chapters. And the reason why sometimes pride is referred to as deluded pride is because the definition of the affliction of pride refers to relating to some positive quality of one's body or mind, and on the basis of observing it, generates a sense of superiority toward others. Whereas if you're just proud about something, you may not have any superior, it may not give rise to a sense of superiority between yourself and others. You could just be happy that you did something useful. So, and there's no problem with that kind of just being proud. When it gives rise to a sense of superiority, then it becomes deluded pride or the affliction of pride. So then he says, belief and faith are not much help in overcoming these 6. We have to understand their nature. He says, if we do not investigate our own mind with introspective knowledge wisdom, another kind of Lama Yeshe-ism, introspective knowledge wisdom, we'll never see what's in there without checking, no matter how much we talk about our mind and our emotions. We'll never really understand that our basic emotion is egocentricity, and that this is what is making us restless. Now, to overcome the ego, he says we don't have to give up all of our possessions. We're restless because we cling to our possessions with attachment. Ego and attachment pollute our mind, making it unclear, ignorant, and agitated, and preventing the light of wisdom from growing. The solution to this problem is meditation. So here again, Lama Yeshe is saying that, formal practice is still the root of how we're going to, overcome these. We study, the teachings to get the first level of wisdom, the wisdom of listening. And then we reflect on the wisdom of listening or reading or hearing, that gives rise to a degree of clarity about, what does this word, what are the definitions of these things? How is this different than this? But then we have to reflect on that and think, where does this fit with other things that I've learned? How do I see this, arising in my own experience? What questions, what still seems unclear based on what I have read or have heard? What doubts or questions do I need to get resolved for this to make more sense to me? So that's the level of wisdom of reflection or contemplation. And then the wisdom arising from meditation is the third step in that process. And so unavoidably, the Buddhist path is one that where meditation can't be skipped. But he does point out that meditation has a broader definition, encompasses things other than sitting on a cushion, you know, just single-pointedly concentrating. He says meditation is an alert state of mind. Meditation is wisdom. We should remain aware every moment of our life, fully conscious of what we're doing and why and how we're doing it. We do almost everything unconsciously, he says. We eat unconsciously, we drink unconsciously, we talk unconsciously. Although we claim to be conscious, we are completely unaware of the afflictions rampaging through our minds, influencing everything we do, he says. So, of course, introspective awareness is a skill, and he's encouraging us to bring it into daily life as much as we can. And when we do, when we catch the arising of the afflictions in the mind, when we begin to notice that the mind is moving into attachment or anger or what have you, and we apply an antidote, then that's quite good. And that's partially what he's talking about. We'll be more successful in doing that if and when we're also practicing, on the cushion as well, and developing these skills when nothing is particularly happening, when nothing, we're not being challenged, when the affliction isn't actually arising. When we're just sort of thinking about the last time the afflictions arose and what it felt like, and that's a sort of a training ground that is still necessary if we want to be successful in daily life applying introspective awareness. Okay. Day 241, I'm going to begin with attachment, understanding these afflictions. Ignorance, attachment, anger, pride, deluded doubt, and wrong views. So he's just starting with attachment here in the next day. Now, quotation is, if we're going to learn only one thing from our Dharma studies, it should be that every problem on earth comes from attachment. So, and I mean, of course, it's true that fundamental ignorance is still a subtler, afflicted state, and without it, attachment can't arise. But kind of the day-to-day manifestation that's generally most problematic is craving and grasping, in terms of just our behavior and the things that we say and that we do that get us into trouble and create karma, is most directly related to craving and grasping. And so we can work with craving and grasping in a, you could say, coarser way, but we can apply antidotes to craving and grasping even before understanding much or anything about overcoming fundamental ignorance. And that has a profound benefit in terms of avoiding non-virtue and so on. Yeah. So again, attachment is a mind that apprehends something that we think of as pleasant, enjoyable, and then needs to be connected to it, needs to have it be part of our experience. And um, aversion is really the flip side of that, where um, we desire something, and the opposite of that thing that we desire is what's actually in our experience. We desire to be able to, get to work quickly and easily, and the traffic jam that gives rise to our frustration is preventing our desire, and so anger or aversion arises. Any thoughts or questions so far? So day 242, the quotation, every moment of unchecked anger builds up the energy of anger within. So we've talked about how with all of the afflictions, they are a tendency, a habit, and the more that we indulge in that habit, the deeper that tendency becomes, the more generalizable it becomes. So we may think that there are certain circumstances that I should get angry in, and but by indulging in those circumstances, then there's kind of peripheral cases. Well, what about when this happens? Well, sure, I should also get angry there, and then but it'll branch out the more we practice it, because we also might start to see that maybe we get our way when we act aggressively with others. So we might just start being like, well, that was cool. Like that person gave me what I wanted. They stopped doing what I didn't want them to be doing. So maybe I'll try that again, in a different situation. And then it just sort of snowballs. Um, so he says anger is the worst karma to have. Not only does it destroy our good quality, peaceful, joyful life right now, but it also destroys our good quality next life as well. Um, so then, of course, he talks about how even brief moments of extreme anger, we lose all mindfulness, we lose all and then, you can say something that ends a friendship that you've had for many years. You can lash out physically, and even you know inadvertently take someone's life. There are many fights and things where it just sort of got out of control, got out of hand, and wasn't necessarily a long process of thinking and planning, and but there was just this incredible flash, this. And then um if there's a weapon nearby, or that's all that it takes, is just 1 second of that intense delusion in the mind, and really awful consequences can spring from that. So he says somehow we need to digest or abandon the emotion of anger through meditation, through analytical wisdom, through whatever method we can use. So by understanding the faults of anger, the benefits of patience, by practicing patience in the face of difficult circumstances, by seeing all sentient beings as having been one's own mother, since beginningless time. There's all kinds of, um, and even just training in love and compassion. These are all states, kind of antidotal states that can overwhelm that feeling of agitation as it begins to arise. And the earlier that we catch it, when we catch it, when it's just a sense of frustration, when it's not so strong, when the mind is just, maybe we see the person that we have conflict with, and we notice that just, they haven't said anything today, they haven't done anything today, but just based on past habits, we're like waiting for it. We're expecting that they're going to. Um, and so and then that is setting, and maybe they will, because maybe that really is a stable pattern, that we're also participating in. But, and then if it does happen, we've set ourselves up even before they said or did anything to react in that same habitual negative way, instead of, whereas if we could catch that, when they were still across the room, and think, well, no, this person has been limitlessly kind to me over beginningless past lives. And they just don't remember in this life, and I don't remember in this life, but it's nevertheless true. Then just like if the person who was, did that for you in this life, your caregiver, whoever it is that played that role, for you, if they were having a bad day, and you would be much more magnanimous about the whole thing, because you have that feeling warmly and strongly in the mind. But there's no logical or valid or reasonable distinction between seeing that, and remembering it, versus, well, like Geshe shared the other day was saying, we don't remember even just the early part of this life. And someone could have saved our life, during that time. Maybe we were choking, maybe we almost drowned. And a neighbor or a family member, literally, or we could have wandered off somewhere, and they kept us from all kinds of things. It could, and that's probably not super uncommon given, young kids, and kind of the dangers of, those sorts of things. Pulling us back from a car that was speeding down the road. All kinds of these things happen all the time. Um, and but we don't, it happened when we were 2 or 4, but it happened. Like, it's a real thing that genuinely happened, and other people can tell us about it. And if they do tell us about it, then we'd be like, oh, that's extraordinary. Like, this person, and immediately we would feel more warmly toward that person. Um, uh, and is not different between, all of those things really genuinely happened over beginningless past lives. And it's just our own memory, but our own memory is fallible, even just in this life. And so that doesn't, to base how we relate to people on the strength of our memory is silly. Basing it on logic and reason is what we should do, is what makes sense. And so that's that's one way that we can create spaciousness in the mind, or create that kind of goodwill that can change habit patterns. And of course, there's always, the tension in our culture, that also kind of, came up in Geshe-la's recent class where, the idea doesn't exist in our society that it is possible to abandon anger. The only idea that we have in our society is that we can manage it, that we can learn not to, be violent. We can learn not to be verbally abusive. But if you go to Venerable Urbina says the same thing. If you go, if you do struggle, if a person has a short temper and they want to do something about it, and they go to a therapist and they say, okay, I want you to tell me, how do I get rid of all of my anger? They would say, well, no, I can't do that. That's not possible. I can just give you some tools to help you keep it, under control, help you prevent you from breaking laws, on the basis of your anger. But the Buddha is saying we don't actually have to have any anger in the mind. And then, the sort of the secular humanist view is, well, it's kind of part of the human condition. And that's true, but enlightened beings are not humans, right? I mean, it's a totally different realm of being. So in a way, we are actually transcending the human realm. It is true that it is part of the human experience. It is part of the human condition, but so are all of the other afflictions also. It's just that there's this desire to sort of keep a space for anger in the mind, whereas we might see the faults of other things more easily. So. Any thoughts or questions? Objections, concerns?
Does it seems to me, I don't know, I'm just getting this idea that anger kind of puts the onus on something outside ourselves, as opposed to saying somehow it generates in here. It's not generated out there, it's a response to something else.
Yeah. I mean, we say, oh, this is making me angry, or this person made me angry, as if they have that power, as if that's within their ability. And that isn't true. There was a circumstance that our mind met with, and we lacked the ability to interact with that stimulus without anger. That is entirely on us. And that's not to say that, we're a terrible person, because that's true. It just means that's just like saying, well, this is a difficult driving condition, and so it caused the accident. But there are people on the earth who can drive better than you, and they could have driven that and been fine. Like, they wouldn't have gotten into an accident. But you just hadn't learned how to drive to that. And it could be a really high level of skill that would have been necessary, like someone who's taken a lot of classes and, practiced for hours and hours and hours. But there are people that have done that and can do that, but that person who got into the accident just hasn't yet. And so we just haven't learned, maybe we've learned how to deal with some things, but there are still other things that are still to this day, triggering that, because that's just a skill that we've not yet developed. But it is certainly, the Buddha is certainly saying that we can create the causes and the conditions in our own mind to be able to meet with that same circumstance, like you're saying, that person who's insulting, who's even physically violent. And, we do something, we try to bring that situation to a resolution. We try to we engage in some action, but we are able to engage in that action with a calm, peaceful, even tempered mind, a mind that doesn't wish them harm, as we are kind of navigating what's happening and trying to, kind of create a better circumstance. We have a very, equanimous, peaceful mind as we're engaging in that path of trying to bring some resolution. But yeah, definitely the phrasing that we use of, oh, this is making me angry, why are you making me angry? It's, it isn't, as you're saying, it isn't taking responsibility for the tendencies and the habits and the things um, that are part of our mind right now. And, but we also have to be reasonable and say, well, yeah, there are things that are just, I'm just not there yet. I haven't learned this, I'm pretty good here, I'm pretty good there, but still there are these other things that I haven't figured out yet, and that's fine. But just to understand that it is possible, we can progress further and further. And like kind of where the car analogy, breaks down is that's there probably is some combination of, because of the limitations of human bodily reflexes, and the mechanics of, the physics, gravity and momentum. There certainly are some circumstances where no one could have avoided an accident because there are built-in limitations. But the mind has no built-in limitations. The mind can be developed limitlessly. So we can't say that well, if this was happening to a Buddha, they would get angry or something. They might show a forceful action to subdue, a person, but in their mind, they would have no ill will. They wouldn't have any actual anger in their mind. Because it's just a qualitatively different sort of a thing. There's no materiality involved. And so because it's pure energy, there are no limitations that you find with, kind of all of the analogies and examples that you might draw on, that do have the laws of physics and biology and so on. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. So the last thing that we'll cover for today is day 243, where now Lama Zopa is teaching on fundamental ignorance. Um, so, and actually, kind of, he's talking about here not only fundamental ignorance, because he says the quotation is, ignorance is like a house where there are no windows or doors and it's completely dark. And then he says there are two types of ignorance. One is the thought which is unclear about relative truth, and the other is the thought which is unclear about the absolute nature of all things. The first, so this is kind of like ordinary ignorance versus fundamental ignorance. The first type of ignorance, and I mean they're both kind of in the same vein. But he says the first type of ignorance is the unknowing mind, the unseeing mind. It's like when our eyes are closed, we can't see the object. Ignorance of relative truth means not understanding karma, the Four Noble Truths, or the objects of refuge. We could also say, like, impermanence. If a person doesn't understand or doesn't care to investigate, kind of any of the sort of lesser statements about reality that the Buddha posited. So he posited karma as a statement of reality. He posited the Four Noble Truths as a statement of reality. He posited objects, the three jewels being the only three genuine sources of protection, as a statement about reality. But then there are others, like I say, like impermanence, death, these things, which are different than like, loving kindness is a good idea. We don't have to, the Buddhism certainly encourages compassion and loving kindness. But, and we could say that maybe there are statements about that are true, like, they improve our relationships with others, the more we react out of a sense of love and compassion, but to say that, love and compassion are sort of baked into reality isn't true. You can choose not to cultivate it, but to say that the Four Noble Truths are not baked into reality, you can say that, but Buddhism would argue with you and say, well, yes, you can say that, but that's a wrong view. You are incorrect. So there is ignorance that is just an unknowing, either through kind of a willful ignorance, meaning, you don't want it to be true, or you believe in some philosophical system that seems contradictory, and so you're not interested in investigating these things that are posited as true. Or it could just be that you've never heard of these, if a person has never been presented with the teachings on karma, the teachings on the four, then they would also be ignorant in this sense, this kind of unknowing, unseeing mind. It's just not part of their experience at that point. But then there's a deeper level of ignorance, which is fundamental ignorance, which is, as he says, ignorance about absolute truth. And this is different, not only in relation to the object being absolute truth, and these other objects are other parts of reality that are not absolute truth. It's not only different in the object that we're talking about, but it's also different in the sense that the first kind that he mentioned is a simple lack of knowing, a simple unknowing. And the second kind is an active misapprehension. And it's more than an unknowing. It is, it has the aspect of unknowing because the truth of the ultimate nature of things isn't part of the mind, we're not making decisions, we're not living from a place of deep understanding of the teachings on the nature of reality and so on. So it has a quality of that kind of unknowing, but it's worse than that because it is joined with the belief that we are apprehending things clearly, that we do see things in an unmistaken, clear way. So we actively misapprehend all of the things that we experience. And we think that, so we don't, and this is just kind of under normal daily circumstances, this sort of unconscious, subconscious way of relating. When we see something pleasant, we don't, the object appears to us as if it's made out of pleasantness. When we see something aversive, it is as if the object is made out of aversion, out of pain and difficulty and strife. And so not only do we not know that that isn't its nature, we assent to that, to the false view that it is, that is its nature, and we relate to it through that mistaken understanding. Of course, we can fix this, but that is sort of the default that we have. So he says, like, when we apprehend a rope, he's giving kind of the historical analogy in the sutra about observing like a rope, a coiled rope in the distance at dusk, where if we can't see clearly, he says, we don't know that it is a rope. So on one level, we could just say, yeah, there's a shape, down there. I don't know what it is. He says the mind which doesn't see the rope is like the ignorance of the relative truth. Because it is, I mean, if it was clearly illuminated and you would call it a rope, that is conventionally what we would all call it. And so that is how it is existing, in the distance at dusk. That is its conventional nature. But because of the obscuration of the distance and the lack of light, we could say, well, I'm not sure what that is. We're not labeling it accurately as in the way that we would under different circumstances. Normally, we would say, oh yeah, there's a rope over there. He says the mind which believes that piece of rope is a snake is like the ignorance of absolute truth. So here it isn't just that we say, yeah, there's something over there, I'm not sure. We think, well, that's probably because it's coiled up and it's, kind of in a ball, and it's circular, or what is rope? I don't know. It's in a, what is that shape? Like a tube shaped? I don't know if there's a geometric term for a tube, but it's like a coiled rope. So, and because snakes, they're also rope-like, and they also kind of sleep that way. We might say, well, that it is a snake. Like, I believe it's a snake, and we might get afraid, and we might, go on the other side of the street because our heart might start racing. We might start calling, animal control. We actually take actions. We relate to it, and we think, oh, that's definitely a snake over there. And it's not. At no time was there any snakeness in that object. It always and forever was only a rope. But because our physiology changed, our heart rate, our breathing, our, a fear response, all of that was based on layering on top of this thing that we could have just said, yeah, there's a thing, but no, we misapprehended it actively. We said, pretty sure that's a snake. And so that's like this deeper level of ignorance where we're not just content to be like, yeah, I'm not sure what that is. We give it a nature, we give it some, and there is nothing from what we're giving it that's present in the object. It's a complete hallucination, a complete fabrication. Everything that we are layering on top has no basis in the object itself.
Sometimes you can even hear the rattle of a rattlesnake.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I lived like I've told the story a couple, like I have sort of like PTSD from living with a family of mice for a year. So I mistake like sounds like rustling, and I'm like, there's definitely a mouse in this house, because I for an entire year there was like a whole family of mice and it was not pleasant. I did not enjoy it. Um, they were safe from being murdered, but I was not happy about it. Um, so see, and if I had been a better practitioner, then I would have been. I would have been overjoyed. I would have been thrilled. I was not. Um, all I could do was not murder them. That was the best I could do, and that was where I was, and that's probably where I still am. Um, yeah.
It's like we don't just label it, we make up whole gigantic stories about the
Hmm.
things that sit before us. It's so easy to do with, I mean, I've been working full time in a while, so it's like, oh, it's easier, but it's so easy to go back to something every day if I don't clear my mind and start to like build up a whole idea about someone or about a situation. And that becomes something I believe.
Yeah. 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 Just earlier, this funny story. I was opening my Kindle app and to get today's book on the screen, and kind of all of the books were there. And the first one was How to Meditate. And I was like, I thought it said How to Monday. And I was like, that would be a great book. Like, I really thought it said that, like How to Monday. Like, somebody should write that book. I was like, I would read that. But it said How to Meditate the whole time. It never said anything other than How to Meditate. Um, but, you know, but yeah,
I would read that book too.
Mondays meditate on impermanence. Monday will not last forever.
Mondays are only conventionally labeled by the mind. Okay, so that's all for today. Any thoughts or questions?
Venerable, I'm just wondering about labeling, and if it means that we have to have a really clear mind in labeling without putting our own layers on top of things. I mean, it seems as though I'm a little confused about labels in the first place. That the idea that a label gives something its existence has always kind of befuddled me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you want to even get into that now, but maybe maybe someday we could sort that one out.
Yeah, I mean, so so of course the wisdom of emptiness isn't postulating that things don't exist. It's only postulating that they don't exist in the way that they appear. So they do exist as a dependent arising. And there's three ways in which all phenomena exist as a dependent arising: independence upon their parts, independence upon their causes and their conditions, and independence upon an act of mental imputation or an act of mental labeling. So we can look at any phenomena, uh, laptop, camera, screen, desk, and think, okay, well, to my sort of subconscious or unconscious mind, just the label is appearing, just the word desk or camera, or and so I feel like there's some findable essence of why it is a desk, why it's not a camera, or why it's not a coffee mug. And I think that reason is findable in the object. I think that there's an essence, a nature that is there, that is why I think of it as that and not something else, not a lamp or a wall. And the Buddha says, I mean, there are conventional reasons why we do that, but it's the object itself that isn't participating in that. That there's, it's true that, it has parts. So it has a top and a bottom and a front and a back, and, and then it is true that, the different parts of it are sourceable to this piece of wood from this tree, or, but then of course, where's that tree from? It's sourceable to a seed, but then where did that seed come from? And so, it's sourceable to another tree, and so on. And then also it depended upon sunlight and moisture and appropriate temperatures in order to become that thing that this wood was ultimately harvested from. Just like the metal, was dependent upon the heat and the pressure and so on, created and even, the star that created the heavy elements, that seeded, the earth with iron and nickel and so on. And so then you bring all of these things together, the causes and the conditions, the workers, the factory, the harvesting, the cutting, the shaping, the melting, the fashioning. And it was done, all of that was done intentionally by people, to create a thing that serves a particular purpose. You can't drink, I mean, you can't compute, you can't do math just with a table by itself. Like, with a computer, you can interface with it and you can watch something, but a movie isn't going to appear from a desk. It can't serve that function, but it serves the function of supporting, things that you put on it. Whatever, it's a flat surface with, one or more legs, one or more supports, because some desks, have like a sort of a base in the middle that kind of flares out, and so it could just have one support, but and then you put things on it, and so it serves a function. It doesn't serve the function, you can't drive it, you can't get in on your desk and go somewhere. It doesn't have an engine, it doesn't have wheels, doesn't serve that function. So people wanted things that were flat and that you could put things on, and so they figured out how to do that, and they made it, and then we all just agree, that's what we're going to call it, that's what we're going to do with it. You could pick it up and bludgeon someone to death with it, you could turn it over and use it, if it was raining and there was a table on the sidewalk, you could get under the table and you would be, but it's not an umbrella, like it wasn't designed for that, but you could use it in that way. So the act of mental imputation is just, this is what I or probably my society is, how we're agreeing to relate generally to this thing that exists, in a completely different context or culture or time or place. The same object might be interpreted in a very different way, even though it might have been created in one place and taken to another. It could be very similar to something that was already there, could be mistaken as serving that function, or they may have a society where a different function is a much more pragmatic use of that thing. And so they're just going to start using it like that because they live in a society that has a different set of needs, a different set of circumstances. So they're going to take your thing and they're going to use it for something that you would never have occurred to you. And they might think that it was designed for that. They might think, oh, well, it has the essence of being used for what I'm using it for because of my culture, because of my society, because of what is happening in my daily life. And so this seems like this is a great, whatever for my society. And so, all of these things, they exist, they're real, they can be touched and so on. But they don't have the essence of the label in the object itself, which is how we relate to them. When we see a car, we just think, oh, that's a car, but we don't think of all of the causes and the conditions that were necessary to create the car. We don't think of, if I take away the left front door handle, was that a necessary part of the car or not? Do I still have a car? Do I not still have a car? I saw it and it was part of why I labeled it a car. So does that make it a necessary? When does it stop being a car? When I start taking parts away. If I have all of the parts in a warehouse, do I have a car or do I not have a car? So it isn't to negate the existence of things. It's just to say that the way in which they exist has nothing to do with how we relate to them, how we are thinking about them. We're only seeing it as a label, as car, and then we think, well, it's a car from its own side, and I'm not doing anything to generate that label. I'm just noticing that there is a car, but really there's all of these parts, there's all of these causes and conditions, and then there's a lot of societal and cultural education and indoctrination, or whatever you want to, that really gives me the label of car, tells me how I should relate to this thing, that isn't telling me how to relate to it, that isn't telling me what it is, because it isn't anything from its own side. I mean, it is there is an object, but it isn't, because it can be used in different cultures in different ways. It can validly serve a variety of functions. And so the one function that I'm choosing to relate to it in is not anything other than what my mind is doing at that time. Yes, please.
It seems to me like it becomes problematic when not only are we limiting something, but we might, well, and sometimes a limit is that too, like, oh, this is just, like if we have, prejudices about something, then we might label something with bigotry and not see its full potential. But also it seems problematic when we do a label that's qualifying it. So it's a car, oh, it's a beat up car, or this is a mean person, and so therefore now I'm going to deal, then it's going to feed that attachment or aversion. And it might hit into, a raw nerve. Like if I think someone's mean, then that's a raw nerve. I might react. I might skip over all rational thought and react.
Yeah, definitely. So there's the very subtlest level of reification, is just the label itself, just the mere. But then, as you're saying, kind of in a maybe more visceral or more immediate are the qualities that we ascribe. So beautiful car versus ugly car, because then that's going to trigger, as you're saying, attachment or aversion, or not just person but kind person or unkind person. So the labeling them, or the assenting to the false view of them existing inherently from their own side is the subtlest way. But then the qualities and the importance of the qualities that we also simultaneously ascribe to that, they have a profound effect also on the afflictions. But they fall away when you go to that subtlest level too. If you go right to that subtlest level, then of the misapprehension, then those problematic qualities are dealt with at the same time, which is the good part of understanding the nature of reality, is that we just, if we can, we go to the most fundamental mistaken view and we overcome it. And then all of the attributes that we've also layered on top of, because if it's not a car at all from its own side, then by definition, it's also not an ugly car or a pretty car or a car that has some sort of social status or whatever. But in terms of our day-to-day life, yeah, probably, in terms of the triggers for affliction, the qualities, the attributes are really, really important. And like I said, that's in terms of like the teaching on attachment that came earlier, we can work with that also separately. We can, overcome these biases also separately, without touching the deepest level of, what is it actually a car?
Thank you both.
All right, so we'll leave it there for today, and so we'll end with dedication. So recollect our altruistic motivation and think that we've actualized that motivation by listening and contemplating. And that has created a positive energy in the mind that we want to dedicate as causes for our spiritual growth and development, and in spiritually meaningful, beneficial ways. So on your own, just think of how you want to dedicate that positive energy. All right. Well, have a good weekend, and yeah, we'll pick it back up on Monday.
Thanks, Venerable.